So you may have to confirm, I think, on your screen. Some of you may have the, yeah. Okay, fantastic. All right, everybody. Hello. I hope everybody can hear me okay. My name is, excuse me, my name is Chris Maynor. I'm a research fellow and assistant professor for biomedical engineering at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville. And it's my great pleasure and honor to host today's discussion panel where we'll be discussing physiological adaptations in space. We have a great number of fantastic speakers, some of which also have provided additional videos of their work and discussing their work on the YouTube channel. If you haven't already, go ahead after this panel and go and look in more detail on what everybody's working on. Feel free to contact us. You can always contact me or the organizers if you want to reach out to any of the speakers afterwards. If you, find yourself wanting to make any kind of collaborations. So I'm really pleased to welcome everybody and all the speakers. In general, just as usual, as regular housekeeping, please, for all the guests and the speakers that are not currently speaking, let's mute ourselves. I will try to also watch out for that so that we give everybody the best possible platform. For our viewers, if you have any questions after each of our speakers introduce themselves or during the discussion, please feel free to use the chat function and we will include your questions at the end. These sessions are recorded and will also be uploaded onto the YouTube channel afterwards and should appear in the next couple of hours. And with that, without further ado, we're going to start into our exciting panel. And I would like to introduce Dr. Danielle Carroll, who is a medical professional and surgeon and former Air Force pilot. She is a NASA Trish-funded space health researcher with also, in addition, because why not, a dual master's degree in aerospace engineering and engineering management. Always puts everybody else to shame, wondering what have I done with my life. So I'm very excited to hear more about your work. From my understanding, her work focuses on the development of systems and system management for surgical disease and critical care for astronauts for upcoming explorations to the moon, Mars, and beyond. And with that, Carol, Danielle, sorry, please take it away.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And I hope you all can see my screen here. So, in these types of scenarios, I always feel like I'm very humbled by by the backgrounds of all the folks on the panel. So, everybody's background is different, and mine has certainly been windy, but I wouldn't change a thing. I've loved every bit of it. So, as Chris mentioned, my name is Danny Carroll. I am a physician. Before going into medicine, I actually flew airplanes on active duty in the Air Force, as she mentioned, so T-34s and T-38s, and you can see some of the photos here. It's a pretty fun airplane. And then after that, I transitioned into the reserve to step into a med school spot that I had earned while I was still in college. During that time, I rotated at Johnson Space Center and had an opportunity to really be exposed to, all things space flight. I had, certainly, and I still do fly very regularly. But seeing it from the space flight perspective was distinctly different. And this photo is taken upside down, just so you know. It's kind of like a tradition for that particular clerkship. So anyway, having been exposed to general surgery from a very young age, just like I was exposed to flying, I ended up choosing to go into general surgery for my residency. I've done 3 clinical years of surgical training, and then I peeled off from that, as is pretty typical in surgery, to do a dedicated research block. And for me, what that's looked like is first I did a Trish Space Health Innovation Fellowship, and that was for about a year. It got hit pretty hard by COVID. And so I had already enrolled in the master's program at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is initially it was in strictly aerospace engineering with a focus in a field called bioastronautics, which is essentially the study of the human body in the spaceflight environment. So right up my alley. And then alongside that, I actually started taking more and more courses in engineering management. And so ended up, going into their dual degree program. Alongside that, I've been a principal investigator on a NASA or Trish grant of my own, which has been fantastic, looking at developing capabilities to advance medical readiness for upcoming exploration class missions. So very exciting stuff in my opinion. And then I also started a company last year. So this has been kind of riding the COVID wave, if you will. But my company is called Orbital Biodesign. We've got a couple devices in the pipeline, but the idea is to create new technologies that could be useful for us, not just in the terrestrial setting, but also in the space flight setting. So, I want to be able to bridge that gap, because as everybody on this panel knows, a lot of the problems that we see in space are really just accelerated versions with slight changes, but oftentimes they're just accelerated versions of what we see on Earth. So if we can intervene on those effectively, we can really make some good things happen in all those different settings. So alongside that, I am a regular presenter on something called the Cosmos Show. It's a bi-weekly YouTube show sponsored by Wyoming Stargazing. So that's been a pretty fun opportunity as well. And then I'm the president of the Space Surgery Association. So this is from Colorado. It's beautiful here. It actually snowed a little bit last night. And so this is in case anybody who's watching this might be interested, you're welcome to join. The website, as you can see, is spacesurgery.org. And the email address, if you'd like to become a member, is spacesurgery@gmail.com. But we've got about 175 members right now, including Rowena Christensen, one of the coordinators of this meeting. And it's really just been, it's been a joy to get to lead this organization for the last 6 months or so. And we're seeing some really exciting things happening. So with that, I will hand it off to the next person, I think. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's very fantastic having you on this panel. So next we'll turn it over to Mark and introduce himself, who seems to have disappeared for the moment. Yeah, okay. That's okay. I'm sure he'll come back in a second. We'll jump over to Heather. So for that, sorry, just a second here. Dr. Heather Alloway is an assistant professor at Louisiana State University and is also a previous Trish postdoctoral fellow, as we also discussed earlier. And the focus of her work is on the use of oral contraceptives and mitigation of bone loss. I hope I got that right. So Heather, please take it away. Very excited to hear more about your work.
Yeah. Awesome. So yes, thank you, Chris, for the kind introduction. I am Dr. Heather Alloway, and I'm the director of the Women's Physiology Research Lab and an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology at Louisiana State University in the United States. I have a bachelor's in biology and physics, a master's in obstetrics and gynecology. I got a certificate from the International Space University in their space studies program. And I have a PhD in integrative and biomedical physiology. And all of that was before I traveled to Texas and became a Trish postdoctoral fellow. So my research program focuses on women and how from menarche to menopause, that cyclic changes in the ovary and the hormones that go along with them get influenced by the things we do, like eating things and exercise or spaceflight, and how that then integrates and impacts your cognitive function, your bone and muscle, your immune system, and your cardiovascular function. And I do this using both human and animal models. And I did my master's and PhD with the human model and my postdoctoral fellowship. As in my presentation described, I started using the animal model for spaceflight, where I specifically looked at contraception and bone. And so my program is looking to see how different things that women do throughout their lives influence their osteoporosis risk later in life, and how that can then influence different aspects of performance, which comes into play in our female astronauts when we think about moving to the moon, and especially moving to Mars. Will their bones be strong enough when they get there to support all of the activities they need to perform as astronauts?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather, and welcome to the panel. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Matthew Mark Milleen. He's medical director at the Wound Healing Institute in Edina, Minnesota, and he's also a previous colleague at the Mayo Clinic, where he did his fellowship in Rochester. His studies focuses on lymphedema and SANS. Please, Mark, take it away. Oh.
Thank you, Chris. Really an honor and humbling to be with this group. So I'm going to run through these slides in less than 5 minutes. And part of what we're looking at is how lymphedema and something called the endothelial glycocalyx impacts how potential microvascular function is in weightlessness, because it translates directly to how we treat patients in our wound clinic. And as my slides are not advancing, so part of the concept is we look at our patients with venous leg ulcerations and lower extremity edema. The vast component of that is something called lymphedema, and we've termed that lymphedema of venous etiology, or we talk about leading with love as we treat our patients. It's a significant fluid shift, and it's a 1G indicator of what's going on in our wound clinic when we look at our patients with significant lower extremity edema. So when we start to look at the lymphatic vasculature throughout the body, it's an area that has not been well researched, certainly in Leo. Dr. David Zawaja and Walter Cromer down at Texas A&M and Mike Delp at FSU have done some phenomenal work in this area, both in true weightlessness as well as in space analogs. But as we look at the spin-off potential, if we understand microvascular function and oscillatory shear and how it impacts something called the endothelial glycocalyx, we can spin this off back into our wound clinics to accelerate wound healing and then ideally decrease recidivism rates. And that's where my interest got in. And then the other component is the work that Drs. Ward and Smith are doing down in Houston with their work on the multi-hit theories with SANS, specifically looking at the genetic component. So as you look at the astronauts at risk or crew at risk, when you start to look at their single nucleotide polymorphisms for the data that's available, you start to see significant overlaps in who's developing SANS and who is not, based on some of this precision personalized evaluation. So we recently did this within our own wound clinic and looked at a very single abnormality of MTHFR, found that within our wound clinic, 52% of patients not healing their venous leg ulcers actually had an MTHFR abnormality. So what that translates to, we think, at the microvascular role with endothelial glycocalyx production is uncoupling of endothelial nitric oxide synthetase, so they can't produce endothelial nitric oxide. That is impacting negatively lymphatic contractility, changes arterial vasodilatation, and also has an impact on certain cytokines. So as we look at 52% abnormalities in our wound clinics, it becomes apparent why we're having such a hard time getting our these difficult chronic wounds to heal, and why the recidivism rate's so high, because we're not treating the totality of the patient. So ultimately, if we could get to something like 23andMe, where we can do buccal scrapings and get a true risk factor evaluation of our wound clinic patients and start to be more precise in adjunctive micronutrient application within these patients in addition to standard of care wounds, I think we can really start to accelerate outcomes and decrease recidivism. And there's just such significant overlap, obviously, with the cephalic shifts in weightlessness and the impacts, obviously, that's having on crew health from a vision as well as a intracranial aspect. So I apologize, my slides won't advance, but that's where our interest and where our research is going. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. This is really fantastic. I think we got a really good impression of your work there, and yeah, looking forward to discussing this further. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Virginia Vautrin. She's a professor at the International Space University and joining us from Strasbourg in France, which we earlier discussed as a beautiful place to be. Her work is focused on human performance in space. She also has an excellent video that you can view on our YouTube channel. She is also the former chief scientist and deputy director of the TRISH program and was an associate professor previous as well at the Baylor College of Medicine. With that, Virginia, we're really pleased to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Chris. And it's a delight to be here with all of you on this very interesting panel. It seems like we have more in common than we even realized. So just as an introduction, I'd like to point out that, Heather seems really focused on what she does, and Mark also very focused. Daniela pointed out her career path was a little bit windy. So's mine. I started off as a biochemist who became interested in biology and then spent quite a few years studying a short section of one protein, a ligandated ion channel protein. And then I completely changed things around and I went to work in space. Prior to that, I'd had nothing to do with space whatsoever. But I went to lead pharmacology research at Johnson Space Center. And in that position, I really had to be a generalist. They had lots of different kinds of questions about pharmacology in space, ranging from what happens with medication products that are stored on a spaceflight vehicle, to what happens to a human being who takes a medicine when they're in space. We had to cover this entire range of different kinds of questions. And as Chris mentioned, I progressed through a couple of management positions that included TRISH. But now I've decided that I really missed the laboratory. So I took advantage of the opportunity to return to the lab, and I'm in Strasbourg, France, setting up my new lab to use a planarian model to look at the fundamental aspects of regeneration and wound healing. So see, we're all connected here in some exciting ways. So I'm setting up a few different spaceflight analogs for our little planarians. We're going to have, I guess, worm knots here in Strasbourg that we can do some experiments with to learn things about what the astronauts are experiencing. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm excited to meet the others.
Thank you. That's really fantastic. All right. So moving on in our panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sanina Janan. He is also joining us from Florida, small world. He's a NASA Space Biology postdoctoral fellow at the Florida State University, just a couple of hours from where I'm currently sitting, I'm assuming, unless he's working remote. His area of work is also very widely spanned, including physiology, immunology, spaceflight related to medicine, clinical pathology, aging, nutrition, engineering, and with specifically emphasis on microgravity experimentation and nanotechnology. With that, Sunny, please take it away. We're really excited to hear more about your work.
Of course, thank you for your very kind introduction, Chris. And it's a pleasure to be joining you all today. And thank you as well to the organizers of the Australian Space Biology and Health Symposium, providing me the opportunity to join you all at today's panel. As Chris had highlighted, I'm a NASA postdoctoral fellow at Florida State University, having been involved with our space exploration efforts consistently for over 15 years. My current focus is in the area of space medicine, life sciences, and studying how as we reach for the stars, not just to learn more about our universe, but through this journey, we also learn a lot about ourselves. And to see my research in greater detail, please feel free to see my presentation recording, Space Physiology Study of Us. But to share a little bit about more my specific research areas, I'm a cardiovascular physiologist. And as this just provide an overview of the cardiovascular system, which includes the heart, arteries, veins, and lymphatics, with the heart, arteries, veins serving blood to and from all organs of the body, with blood containing macro micronutrients, oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide, while the lymphatic system, as Mark had highlighted, transports lymph, a different component than blood, that contains excess fluid not collected by the veins, but also importantly components of the immune system. Lymphatics also transport lymph to local lymph nodes, which utilize the information contained in lymph to develop immune responses. And moreover, there are various cardiovascular immune adaptations occurring in human space travel. One is illustrated on the right here. On Earth, our bodies have a hydrostatic pressure gradient of 200 millimeters of mercury at the feet, 70 millimeters of mercury at the head. And during microgravity exposure, astronauts experience, as our other panelists have also highlighted, experience a cephalic fluid shift, causing its gradient to become 100 millimeters of mercury across the body. And this fluid shift caused significant adaptations of the vascular system in terms of structure, regulation, and function, with each branch of the vascular system adapting differently, which, to our knowledge, even with regards to low Earth orbit adaptations, is limited. So this is an active area of investigation of myself and others in the space medicine life science community. And additionally, what about, I mentioned the cardiovascular system supports and serves all organs. So do all organs adapt independently in spaceflight? And there's increasing evidence to suggest from my studies, as well as many others, that this is not, that they perhaps adapt in relationship with one another. For example, there's evidence to suggest that there's an integration between adaptations of the cardiovascular system, the gastrointestinal system, or GI, and distant organs from the GI system, such as bone. And why is this important? Well, the function, focusing on the gastrointestinal system, the GI system, the function of this system affects our entire body. The digestive system not only breaks down what we eat and drink, but importantly, absorbs everything we ingest to then provide these materials to sustain every organ's health and well-being. So in turn, if the digestive system is negatively affected and absorption function is negatively impaired, then every organ in the body is negatively impacted. So I've had the opportunity and continuing studies to increase our knowledge in this topic in the context of simulating a Artemis lunar Mars mission, and from these studies, we'll discover for the first time and learn how the adaptations of the digestive system and many organs adapt as we prepare for a return to the moon. Furthermore, as we return to the moon, as many are likely also aware, there are key differences that we should keep in mind in comparison with our past and ongoing missions versus future missions. Specifically, missions to the moon where the astronauts will be exposed to deep space radiation. And on their journey to the moon, they will travel beyond the Van Allen belts, as illustrated here, surrounding the Earth, which does not offer deep space radiation protection on the moon's surface. So in the context of our knowledge of lunar mission adaptations, we are very much limited in this area. This study is one example, described how cardiovascular adaptations specific to deep space radiation exposure that the Apollo astronauts experienced suggested elevated risk of cardiovascular disease compared to all other astronauts. So I also have currently ongoing research investigation studying the effects of specifically deep space radiation in preparation for our return to the moon. And finally, the perspective we gain from our travels in space are also directly beneficial for life here on Earth. As Mark had highlighted about the condition lymphedema, and in medicine specifically. So I've also studied lymphatics and lymphedema, so I'll provide an example of my own research. So majority of cancer patients receiving radiation therapy experience side effects from radiation therapy. One side effect, image here on the left, the lymphedema that Mark was referring to previously, the swelling in this patient's right arm versus her left. There is no cure for this phenomenon. It is also significantly underdiagnosed, and because there's no cure and is underdiagnosed, the swelling will often develop to become much more severe, especially if not managed early, reaching a point where some patients' limbs may be very limited in use and lack utility. Millions of individuals in the US and across the world suffer consequences for this condition for the rest of their lives. And astronauts also experience a form of swelling that is hypothesized to be due to radiation exposure, perhaps for similar reasons that may be as patients receiving radiation care. I hypothesize there may be some overlap between what is occurring between patients and with what astronauts are experiencing from a basic biological perspective, through my doctorate investigating the specific cell type related with lymphedema, the lymphatic endothelial cells, discovered for the first time that the biology of these specific cells related to radiation exposure is unique and is sensitive to radiation exposure. And to illustrate this, I have two represented images. In the middle is a immunofluorescence staining of lymphatic endothelial cells as they look under normal conditions, control conditions. And on the right is a group treated to X-ray irradiation. And then, as you all may see, the X-ray irradiated group on the right is noticeably different, which showed a direct effect of radiation. And this basic experiment, the first of its kind, will provide the first steps and clues as to what's happening in the context of lymphatic endothelial cells to radiation exposure for both patients and astronauts. So in conclusion, our human space exploration efforts provides a unique opportunity to learn about ourselves not possible here on Earth. It's an opportunity to discover, to engineer, and invent new approaches related with our human space exploration efforts, improving life here on Earth for everyone. And now we live in a time with more human activity in space than ever before. So I'm really excited what our future in space holds together. I'm really looking forward to our discussion here today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic work, incredible. And I'm sure there's a lot of overlap that can be discussed both in this session, but also in the future. Mark is already nodding his head and marking down your email address. So last but certainly not least, to complete the introduction of our panelists, I'm very pleased to introduce Carlo Visi, who is joining us from ESA. He himself is a astronaut instructor, so giving us a very unique perspective, and is joining us from the European Astronaut Center. His background, if I got this correctly, is in software engineering and virtual reality. So we're very interested to hear your perspective on many of the aspects we're discussing here today, and please take it away in form of introduction.
Thank you for your kind words, Chris. I'll share my screen. Hope you can see that. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Carlo Vizzi, and I work as a tech contractor at the European Space Agency, European Astronaut Center, where I work as astronaut instructor. I'm really happy to be here today, sharing this virtual stage with such an amazing colleagues. So thank you for having me. And I think I'm the only one on this panel with a bit of a different background and probably also career. So during my introduction, I will tell you more about my what I call my journey into the space environment. So my journey starts studying computer science engineering at the Polytechnic of Turin in the north of Italy. And I specialize in computer graphics and virtual reality. So I was mainly playing with animation, special effects, and this kind of environment. My first encounter with space was for my degree thesis in Thales Space, that, as you might know, is a French-Italian space manufacturer. So I joined a virtual reality laboratory where they were starting to play with this new VR technology applied to the space domain. So for simulation, visualization, exploitation, or dissemination of data. And that was pretty a pioneer environment in a laboratory back then. I'm talking about almost now, 15 years ago. So I was working there and I was mainly a programmer, and I was working with this kind of technology, and I was also starting to join projects and consortium that were somehow aiming the exploitation of such a technology for industries. Back then, I also realized that programming was not my big skill, and you need to learn also when you step back from something. And that was a good choice for me, because from that moment I also started to lead the trial and assessment campaigns of all these projects. So somehow I was using my technological background to fill the gap in between the software side and the industry side. So requirements from the industry filling with technology on this on the other side. I worked in Thales space for a few years, and then I moved to Altec. So it's just a few buildings away from Thales space. So Altec is a company that is owned by Thales space by the Italian Space Agency, and they provide advanced space services from engineering to ISS exploitation, training, operational, and anything you can see in this slide. So once again, I was hired to do something that was not related to VR and AR technology, but again, I tried to find my own way over there. So I tried to convince my management to invest in such a technology because it could be also useful. So my start with that in Altec wasn't the best. So that's what I had available back then. Very old technology, very hard to really impress or show something out of it. But in a few years, I really managed to get some investment and create a real virtual reality laboratory. And after that, also the amount of projects changed. So we were investing, or we were working in better projects. And we were also targeting much more training in space or in any kind of other industry environment, but also astronauts. So we wanted to create something to ease life for astronauts, for trainers. So as I say, my company is providing these training services to the European Space Agency. So one day they asked me if I wanted to move on the other side. So move from developing or creating things for astronauts and trainers to being one of the trainers. So at first I say no, of course, because I'm a Southern Italian. So the idea to move to Germany wasn't really appealing, but I couldn't bail of such an opportunity. So in the end, I moved to Germany, where I'm still working at the European Astronaut Center, and I'm an astronaut instructor. I also train the ground support personnel, so the people working in the Mission Control Center. I'm the operational leader of some of the experiments that are performed on the International Space Station. I could involve for neuroscience to any kind of experiment that could be regarding physiology and not. And I'm also still involved in the XR activity, as you can see in some of the picture here. So I'm still trying to find a way to ease life for trainers, since I'm one of them now, or for astronauts. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carlo. This is really exciting. And I'm going to pretend not to be hurt that you didn't want to move to my native country.
Sorry for that.
That's okay. I also moved away. Anyways, so really very excited. And to maybe actually get us started in the discussion here, really from at this point from an astronaut perspective, if you will. So asking the astronaut instructor, what is currently, so that we kind of set the stage currently for human space travel from your perspective and from your experience. I know that, you know, it's not entirely your area, but what is it that, you know, is looked at for astronauts that are currently training in terms of physiological and cognitive abilities? What is it that you know, really makes a difference for those moving on in the programs, but also kind of being cleared, like from a health aspect, for missions?
Well, of course, being health from a physical and psychological point of view, it's very important when you are selected as an astronaut. So being an astronaut is really, let's say, it's a really cool job, but it's also really challenging. You have to work in such a demanding environment from all points of view, from all the aspects that you can imagine. So it's not something that it's something that sometimes it's really not easy to see. So you have to work in such a challenging environment. You have to work in a really far or remote place, and it's not that you can come back whenever you want. You are stuck there at the moment in the International Space Station. After it will be again in the Gateway or on the Moon or on Mars. So that requires also a lot of psychological fine-tuning. You really need to be ready for such a challenge. And from the physical point of view, of course, you need to be as healthy as possible. You need to be able to perform in such an environment. And you also need to be considered that during your 6 months, 1 year, in the future, even more mission, you are probably not supposed to be sick or to have any kind of physical problem, because in that case it would be really hard to tackle that. So beside the let's say first aid training that the crew get, or that what they can really do there, it could be really hard to provide some support or cure when you're there. So you have to be as healthy and physically and mentally healthy as possible. And of course, we have seen during the years that the requirements for the selection has changed a lot. So we've seen that for physical selection, for example, we've been moving from 170, around 170 meter to 195, or 190, because of the size of the vehicles that are carrying people to the station. Same for the weight, same for the age. And of course, once you are selected, you have to go through this kind of really hard process. This screening, this kind of selection lasts almost 1 year. So, and at the very end, you end up with probably the best 4, 5, 6, 7 people that are top of their class. So it's really demanding, and it's really important to take all the possible aspects under control when you're selecting this kind of people. But again, we have seen that the trend is really changing. And by the way, during the last selection, ESA was also looking for people with disability. And that's the first time that there was something like that. This is changing because, well, you're all of you are involved into this kind of medical side for in space. So also the fact to see how the body can react, like for a normal human being, it's already amazing. So you can imagine also for people with disability, you can learn a lot. You can learn how the body will react. If the same disability will make you like as disabled as you are on ground or not, and then you can learn and reapply what you learned on ground. So it really leaves a lot of ground for new discovery, I think. So I think the new way we are selecting, the way we're going goes in this kind of requirement that we have for crew, since we're going toward tourism, we are going toward longer mission. It's really opening for a lot of possibilities.
That's a very great insight. Yeah, I appreciate that. Actually, to segue right into that, Danielle, from your perspective, working and advancing medical readiness, really, how, what are the major aspects? What needs to be considered for long-term missions, but also, like both far away, but also remaining in LEO? What is it we need to really consider there?
Sure. So thank you for that question. And thank you also, Carlo, your work is really interesting. So I'd love to pick your brain at some point too. But in response to your question, I think the exploration class mission realm is kind of considered its own entity in a lot of ways. There are some very specific hazards that NASA has outlined that we anticipate encountering. And it makes sense, right? You're going from being in this relatively safe, and protected environment still within Earth's magnetosphere, and which is where the ISS is, and going well beyond that to not just to the moon, but also ultimately to Mars. And so everything is different. And so things that on the medical and especially surgical side, we have to consider, and we're in the process of working on, is how best to perform medical care and to preserve and also optimize crew health longitudinally throughout the course of a long duration mission in which real-time communication with Earth is not feasible. And it seems like that's maybe not that big a deal, but it's actually a complete and total paradigm shift from what we're doing right now. As it stands right now, as you folks are probably familiar or probably aware, on the International Space Station, there's real-time communication happening all the time. Terrestrial resources are used constantly, not just to run, little questions by folks on the ground here and there, but also, for big picture planning, for medical questions, for interviews, for conversations with family members. And so, as Carlo mentioned, the behavioral health aspect is really key, because things like, not just the absence of real-time communication, but also the reality of distance from home. It's distinctly different when you're talking about, oh, it's just essentially 9 hours, give or take a little bit, from, when somebody's on the ISS to when they can be back on Earth. That's 9 hours versus 9 months is a pretty big difference. Or more than that if they're already on their way to, if a crew is already on its way to Mars. So we've got the distance component, we've got the radiation component, which some other folks have talked about. We've got the isolation and confinement piece, which kind of goes back to the behavioral health issue. Let's see, I'm blanking on there are some other big ones, but really it all kind of centers around like the distance from Earth is considered, broadly speaking, to be the biggest challenge moving forward. Again, from a procedural perspective, as somebody who's in the surgical realm, I find that really exciting because that's something that we get to say, okay, well, how can we best do this? How can we prime folks, to be as ready as possible to intervene in as effective a way as possible, to ensure that folks are as proficient as possible when the need arises, knowing full well that, they're not going to be able to be current on every single possible surgical procedure, 2.5 years into a 3-year mission. It's just, even if you take somebody who's a very seasoned surgeon, you're not going to necessarily, have those capabilities. And so, nor do you necessarily need that. We don't anticipate doing an exploratory laparotomy in deep space anytime soon. So, there are a lot of, I guess, components there to consider. And so I find it particularly exciting, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. And I mean, as far as I understand, as long as every instrument has Velcro, we're good. It's a good starting point. Right. So also to kind of go a little bit more into the pharmacology area, Virginia, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of your insights and work on, specifically pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, but also what you mentioned in your introduction, how do drugs relate differently or work differently after being exposed to deep space radiation or just being stored for a long time, even in LEO?
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, these are wide open questions right now. Even though we've been going to space for 50 years, we still don't know the answers to these really fundamental questions. They haven't been considered to be important enough to merit significant studies. And I think that we have to reevaluate that decision when we're thinking about preparing astronauts for having an autonomous medical system on an exploration mission, the way that Danielle was just speaking about. We need to make sure that our astronauts are going to be prepared with medications that are actually safe and effective when they need to be used. And this isn't something that we've had to think about yet because we have the luxury of resupply missions every few months right now on station. If a medication gets old, we can throw it out and just send up new supplies. On a long distance mission, we won't have that opportunity. So we have to think ahead about either supplying medications that last for the whole duration of a mission, which right now, the 3 years that we're talking about is longer than the shelf life of most medications. So we need a paradigm shift here. We need to figure out a way to extend the shelf lives of our existing medications, or perhaps we can figure out ways that astronauts could make medication doses while they're on their missions. So it could be that 3D printing or genetically engineered microorganisms, that these kinds of really different strategies could be used in space. And there's some interesting work going on along these lines. My former colleagues at Trish are funding some of the recent studies.
Right, I appreciate that. I personally also have a little bit of background in pharmacokinetics, so it is definitely something where I have to agree. It's a wide open area that we really need to invest a lot more, time and effort in, if you will. I wanted to also ask a question to Heather. With your specific work on female health, what do you think, like going forward, will really be the deciding factor? I know that like in popular science, there's always a lot of discussion, are male or female astronauts more, suited for long-term missions? Are there really such distinctive risks between male and female astronauts? And is there something that's helpful, to supply similar, like according to your research at this stage?
No, I don't think there's anything critical to supply, but it's for understanding specifically for women what things are different to tailor their kind of pre-training or pre-medical screening to make sure they're as healthy as possible. So because of the current system on the ISS, many or all of the premenopausal astronauts are on birth control, which means is that the urine recycling requires that no blood gets into that system. Therefore, we need to suppress the menstrual cycle. But their choice of birth control is their own choice. They go to their own personal doctor. NASA has zero control over this, which is good because that is private medical information. But what we need to do is find out what each kind of type, whether it's a combined contraceptive or a progestin-only contraceptive, and the different versions of all of these things, how they are pharmacokinetically different in the space environment, and how these medications influence other organ systems that are critical to mission success, and then how they continue to suppress the menstrual cycle across the time that we need without mitigating up mass, which the birth control pill will mitigate. Like that's going to be a lot of pills that need to go. And then would those pills make it there pharmacologically in storage without having radiation degradation or shelf life issues or things like that? Whereas like implantable ones, they're a little bit more protected from radiation and things like that. But pharmacologically, they're in there for this duration. So will their release from the equipment that they are in be the same? So there's a lot of things that still need to go. We're moving there and we're on the right track to get there. And I think the impetus of that half of the Artemis astronauts are female has pushed NASA to make it and look at gender differences and specific female health requirements that are unique to women a bit more of a forefront thing than it has been in the past. And I think I applaud them for taking that step. I know it was we don't want to talk about this with a 10-foot pole before now, but they're moving in the right direction, and I applaud them for being comfortable in taking that step forward.
I agree totally. I guess between your work and also Virginia's work, it kind of, I see kind of a mixed need for both, like basic science research where we're really trying to assess, okay, how is the pharmacokinetics and dynamics changing due to the environment, which obviously, extends well beyond the ISS, with Artemis and then going further, because I believe we can presume that what we experience in LEO is not only because of radiation, but also because of the type of microgravity that's experienced also will significantly influence how these medications behave and the longevity of these medications. So we kind of, if I understand this correctly, we kind of need both, like in vitro assays, but also an analyses, but also actually astronaut tissue and samples in order to assess how effective are the drugs that we're providing, just for this one example, if I'm correct here.
Yeah, whole being, whether animal or human physiology, is kind of critical in fully understanding the pharmacokinetics, and especially at least in the difference between implantable versus oral contraceptives, what Sunny kind of mentioned in his intro is that there is changes in what's going on in our ability to absorb via the intestines. Therefore, that's playing a role outside of just once they're in the blood, how are they pharmacokinetically working? So it's not just what's going on in this cell and is the cell using it the same way, is the whole body system and all of the physiology working in the way it was before to make the medication that we know how it works work the way we know how it works. And if it doesn't, what needs to change?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. This actually kind of moves us into another question that I'm going to direct at Mark here. You mentioned in your introduction, the possibilities for, genetic analysis to, and I hope I got this right, to more or less predict wound healing, to predict certain other aspects. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on this and what that, ideally would mean for future space travelers. And I don't know if you also have insight into, let's say, predictability for reactivity with certain drugs or with certain other components in that.
Well, if I could ask if we could extend this session by about 6 hours, because I'm just full with questions for my colleagues. This is just like phenomenal. So to answer your question, and speaking a little bit what to Heather was talking about, one of the things that actually caught my first interest was the DVT occurrence in the internal jugular vein. And we all know with the cephalad fluid shifts, there's some degree of stasis and even potentially reversal of flow within the internal jugular, which now we know is transmitted into the cerebral sinuses with the paper that was just recently published on the cosmonauts with the 5 pre, 5 post MRI studies. So we know that there is some degree of venous, but we don't know the pressure correlation to correlate with ICP pressures to correlate back with SANS. So part of the challenge is that when I saw that DVT, I knew that there are patients that have, we all say if one of the first things we take in history in a physical examination of the patient, and Danielle talked to that, is we ask about, is there a history of heart attacks? Is there a history of varicose veins? Is there a history of DVTs? When we're asking that question, we're asking basically a simplified Mendelian genetic background. Now, genetics, I think, and like lymphatics and in glycocalyx that I educate on, are incredibly intimidating to people. Once you get outside that normal 4 square, people get very and you start talking about 5 SNPs, everybody goes, oh, wait a second, I don't remember the MTHFR cycle. And so we've all had to do a deep dive on this, but the question I think that we got to start thinking about is if we're going to go to personalized precision health, because if crew's going to be a long ways away from us, why wouldn't we want to know the risk for healing in a situation? So, and then we can translate that back to our ICU. So if we're talking about VLU healing is impaired by a single SNP like MTHFR, what about the people that don't heal a bowel anastomosis, or people that don't heal a thoracotomy, or what do we know about their genetics and why aren't they healing when we're giving them the best of standard care in the United States that's available, despite the fact that they may have diabetes and all the other risk factors? I think we're missing a significant element. And I think that as we move forward, given that Francis Collins figured out the human genomic, it allowed us now to rapidly sequence and understand individual genomics. The price is coming down, much like, what a gigabyte in 1990 cost $10,000. Now it costs less than a penny on my 2 terabyte hard drive. So I think we have to start accessing and accumulating this data to apply to crew health, because it'll quickly spin off to the patients we're taking care of in our ICUs and in the clinics and in the wound clinics. I think the disproportionate win here is really significant. And I just look at the colleagues on this call, the brain trust is here. It's just a matter of creating that Manhattan project and getting it done, because benchtop to bedside can no longer be 15 years. We got to get down to 3 to 5 years to 7 years to accelerate this the benchtop that people are finding, like what Sunny's doing at the benchtop. I should be applying that in my wound clinic in the next 1 to 2 years. So I think that's where we've got to go to. And that's why I think the space environment as an accelerator is so valuable.
I fully agree, and I think, unfortunately, obviously, because we do not have 6 hours, even though we totally should have planned for that. I think we all agree, while not necessarily getting to that question, but like, how does that translate for human health on Earth? And I think all of these aspects, right? If we're talking making medication, creating medication that has a longer longevity and longer shelf life, that's incredibly helpful for health on Earth, like, and for treating people in more remote areas, like. Everything we do and everything we research essentially has applications on Earth. I want to quickly get to Sunny as well. So during your introduction, you hit on the cephalic shift, and it's been something that is actually a personal question of mine. So here it goes. I am wondering if there is any knowledge. So cephalic shift is something that, from my understanding, astronauts experience specifically on the ISS. And yes, there's microgravity, but it's also a unique kind of microgravity, the kind of sensation of falling due to the speed of the ISS around the Earth. So if we were to say we're sending humans back to the moon or beyond and have them travel for months and months, is this kind of fluid shift to be expected there as well? I mean, we know that the lunar surface obviously has a certain level of gravity that's much reduced compared to Earth, but what do we expect in terms of fluid shifts, and what would this mean long-term for humans?
Thanks, Chris, and thank you so much for that question. In short, we don't know. We have an understanding that the SANS, and before it was called SANS-VIP, that phenomenon is temporally based. For example, to be more specific, astronauts, crew that traveled into space during space shuttle did not experience the SANS-related visual changes that long-term astronauts that are staying in orbit 6 months to a year are experiencing. So there's certainly a time factor that particularly exploration class missions are providing different sort of considerations for us to think about in terms of extrapolating our current knowledge of spaceflight medical adaptations in the context of time, but also different environments. We do know that, and our sample size is very small, that there are some adaptations that the Apollo astronauts experienced when they went to the moon, like cardiovascular risk, are suggestions to be elevated. But considering all the multiple different risks that are associated to spaceflight travel, cardiovascular fluid shifts, sensory motor adaptations, immune dysfunction, reproductive changes, every organ is affected in spaceflight, and we're really approaching a stage where we're understanding that in the context of low Earth orbit. So we really have a lot to explore and investigate and study in the context of a lunar mission, certainly.
Oh, and I can totally appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Virginia, I think you had a comment earlier.
I did. So when Mark brought up the idea of sequencing to help us understand individual differences between the astronauts, I wanted to point out that my new colleagues here in Europe are already moving along those lines, I think a bit faster than my former colleagues in the US were. And in a recent ESA topical team on the topic of personalized medicine, I met a number of folks here in Europe who are taking what they know from the clinic and emerging bench knowledge and thinking about how to apply it to astronaut medical treatment specifically. And in fact, we have written up some recommendations and guidelines that are in the publication pipeline right now. And hopefully our recommendations will be public in ESA calls for proposals in the near future as well. ESA have been performing a number of SNP tests already on astronauts in order to best prepare therapeutic strategies for individuals. And they're very open and active along these lines.
That's a very good addition. Yeah, thank you. All right, we're approaching the end of the hour. I know this kind of flew past. I wish we did have longer. Danielle, please go ahead. And if anybody else would like to comment in any final words afterwards, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So I guess just an overarching thought is that, so one part of the work that I've done through the grant that I've had with Trish is working specifically on building a system of collecting biometric data from commercial spaceflight participants and how best to approach that. And I think everybody on this call can probably agree that it's a really exciting time in space, like in space health, space travel, just in the aerospace realm in general. You know, the N number is about to just go through the roof. I guess literally, but you know, so it's really exciting to know that we're going to start getting a lot more data points, and there just will be a greater potential to make those sorts of iterative, draw those like iterative insights and conclusions and make more progress, like Mark was mentioning, on a much quicker, at just a much quicker pace. So we've got a lot to look forward to. In all of these areas. And I think it'll be interesting to see how governmentally, government-funded spaceflight and commercial spaceflight can, interface and interact and kind of complement each other. I hope that it ends up really being like truly a collaborative type of thing, because, that's where I think we all stand to gain the most. But remains to be seen. But it's still pretty exciting, in my opinion.
Absolutely agree. Sunny, go ahead.
Yes, I just wish to add a quick add-on to what Daniel had mentioned in the context of the data points and the increased opportunity to learn more about how we adapt in space, and how our panelists here today in different areas exploring space is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach, and approaching problems and questions from these different perspectives also maximizes our level of discovery and understanding of, and also serving and supporting the crew as they travel in space. So circling back in the context of Carlo had highlighted with regards to crew selection, and what Virginia and Matt and Heather and Daniel had highlighted with regards to the different mechanisms and approaches and ways that spaceflight is a high-risk environment, but is also a unique environment to investigate human health in a very novel and literally out of this world, sorry for the pun, manner, but really expand and serve as a platform for continued exploration of space, but also benefiting life here on Earth.
I couldn't have summarized this any better. So no, it is really a unique time. I think we're all, moving, into this new generation of space travel. Carlo, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to what Daniela and Sunny were saying, I think one of the best benefit coming out of this new era of spaceflight with public and private going in space, in particular for you as a scientist working in the medicine field, is that you will get many more subjects to really assess and evaluate your studies. For what I've seen so far, we are running a lot of experiments that can be physiological experiment related to, I don't know, neuroscience, how the body reacts, how do you react in removing gravity from your reference frame, like from your ability, your brain, anything. But most of the time you see that there is a really lack of, let's say, dissemination of the result of those experiments, because you don't have enough subject. Maybe there are the same experiment is on orbit for, I don't know, even 10 years. But best case scenario, you get, I don't know, 10 astronauts performing that. And in the end, probably it's not enough to, get some conclusion out of it, some result, and really draw a line, say, okay, that's not okay, or how you can learn. I think that's where this new era can lead us, to have more subject and learn much faster about anything, any kind of experiment related to physiology.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of the studies, I mean, today and in the future, we'll have to be very, very careful with how to control and how to design these studies. And I'm sure Heather is having lots of thoughts on this and is probably equally as excited with just as Mark and everybody else to really have that increased number of space travelers in the future, whether those are tourists, to just go into LEO, or whether those are professional astronauts. I think together it will help us advance the sciences and hopefully also life on Earth at the end. So with that, I'm really sad to have to conclude this panel. I'm very, very grateful for everybody sharing their time today and all your insights. And again, I would love to, continue the conversation offline. I'm sure everybody who's going to be viewing this live and also in the recording is really going to enjoy getting all your insights. Thank you very much for joining us today, for your expertise and your time, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you very
organizing.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good meeting, everybody.